Well, in the third part of our series on zombie companies, we take a look at firms that are corporate underachievers, overdosing on that cheap credit from the major economies in Asia, including India, China, and Japan. Now, let's start in India, a country that is home to hundreds of so-called zombie companies. Now, in 2018, zombie companies accounted for 26% of all listed companies in the country, and that is up 13 percentage points from 2008. Now, the rise has become more prevalent because Indian banks have gotten into the habit of basically rolling over these loans rather than writing them off. And this means that firms take on more debt, a phenomenon that can best be explained by former RBI Governor Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who named it the, quote, extend and pretend regime. Now, many subsidiaries of major conglomerates have loaded up on debt, including Adani Power and Reliance Power. Well, over in China, plans were set last year to close all zombie state-owned enterprises by the end of this year. But this strategy will be hard to reach because of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact, as well as Beijing's protracted trade war with Washington. Well, in particular, China's buoyant retail sector is estimated to be home to 20% of the country's zombie companies. And these include the likes of e-commerce player Suning.com, which has overborrowed. And it's a different picture altogether in Japan, with many firms debt shy, actually. But still, zombie firms do exist there. And as we've told you, the term was coined in Japan. Many blame these companies for the country's economic stagnation, or the so-called lost decades, which started back in the 1990s after the huge asset bubble burst. Now, last year, the Nikkei reported that Japan had just over 100 of these walking dead firms, which make up around 3% of all listed companies. While this is low compared with India and China, it can be said that any unprofitable company ultimately harms the economy, since Japan is already battling deflation and recession at the same time. Well, for more on the issue, let's bring in Curtis Chin, Asia Fellow at the Milken Institute, and he's also the former U.S. Ambassador to the Asian Development Bank, and he's joining us from Virginia. Curtis, what exactly is bad about these zombie companies? Because when you look at it from the employment picture, it at least helps these governments revive their economies. And if you could take the lessons from Japan, because really that was the country that sort of in a way started off all these zombie companies in the 1990s, what have we learned from those lessons?
First, I think we need to just take a step back and be clear our definition of a zombie company. These are companies that really are insolvent. They can't pay their bills if it weren't for, as you were noting, easy money. And so as you think about how we allocate capital in any country, whether it's the U.S., Japan, India, or China, money should go to those companies that people have faith in that will succeed, that will innovate. And so what's happening right now, that capital, that money is being misdirected as governments, as state-owned enterprises, as we know in China, are taking advantage of free-flowing money, when in reality, as standalone businesses, they are not sustainable businesses.
But Curtis, we are in unprecedented times right now. If you take a look at the impact, the decimating impact of COVID-19, there is an abundance of capital out there. Look at the kitchen sinking from central banks. I mean, there should be no problem in getting access to capital, and very cheaply.
Yeah, absolutely. For those businesses that will succeed, I mean, they will be the ones that attract capital. What's happening now in China, though, is that state-owned enterprises and really state-owned banks, I'd say, are being directed in some ways to ensure the stability that is so important to China. And particularly, as you know, at a time of a pandemic, jobs are critical as China's economy, while still growing, continues to slow. If we look at China's history, there's so much importance placed on stability. And at a time right now when it cannot meet one's projected growth rates, the Chinese government has a tough challenge. And also, when we talk about the Chinese government, it's always important to note that the local governments, the provincial governments, don't always listen as much as we think they do. They don't always listen to what Beijing wants in the near term. Zombie companies and addressing zombie companies are really that classic double-edged sword. It can hurt you or it can help you. Certainly, China will be better off, any country will be better off by addressing these zombie companies, but they do have to worry about the short-term impact on jobs. And as you noted, at an unprecedented time in our world.
And of course, this has a direct impact, doesn't it, in terms of, the trade friction between China and the United States? Because if you think about it, all of these state-owned enterprises, these zombie firms that are being propped up by, the local, governments in China, how basically keeping these living dead companies alive, and they're flooding the market with cheap products, which is really aggravating the situation in the trade war.
Well, again, we have to look at the specific companies or even sectors very clearly. If you're talking about, let's say, steel, flooding the world with cheap steel is clearly going to exacerbate trade tensions. But that's the reality. When we think about China, I think what's important to stress is that it is also in China's long-term interest to address these zombie companies. That if they want to have thriving businesses, it's going to mean businesses that can compete with companies across the region. The other thing I think is important to know at this extraordinary time is that China will increasingly try and focus on its domestic market. And to do so, maybe that we will address some of these, external issues where what these zombie companies and other companies are needing to do is to serve their own market, given the trade frictions that you've noted.
Curtis, what I find rather interesting about the development of zombie companies in Asia, if you take a look, you've been talking about China, where it's it's not a democracy, it's a one-party system, a little bit autocratic. And then you contrast that with India, which is the world's largest democracy, but yet they face similar issues there. So it doesn't matter whether you have a democracy or whether you have a single-party government, the issue of zombie firms remains prevalent in both these major economies.
Absolutely. It remains ultimately a domestic political issue. Both countries need to address employment and growth, and perhaps even more so in India, given its relative growth rates over these past 2 decades compared to China. As we think about the risk of investors, of people who want to go into either market, clearly in both these markets, they have to factor increasingly in the political risk, because ultimately this is a political question. It's not an economic question. At what pace will countries decide to allow these zombie companies really to fade away, to allow the dead to be dead? And the other thing I might note is that we've talked a lot about state-owned enterprises, state-owned companies, but whether it's state-owned or a private company that's accessing this free-flowing capital, I hope that it isn't just a pause in need reform, but that it is also a time for companies to think through how they can, in the long run, embrace what I refer to as the ESG movement, environment and social governance standards. You don't think about ESG when you hear about zombie companies, and that's for the worse for the region, for our world.
Well, that might be put on pause now. We're dealing with COVID-19, Curtis. We've got to leave it there. Thanks for the discussion. It was very interesting. That was Curtis Chin, Asia Fellow at the Milken Institute and former U.S. Ambassador to the Asian Development Bank.